Now, former South African Post Office CEO Mark Barnes is not giving up on his attempts to salvage the state-owned entity. He outlined a proposal a couple of months ago, which he had previously sent to the former Communications Minister Khumbudzo Ntshavheni on how to salvage the enterprise that's currently under provisional liquidation. Businessman Mark Barnes joins us now for more on his proposal. Mark, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. The creditor went to court to recover his money, and the creditor chooses a rather draconian, maybe even severe process, which is provisional liquidation, unlike the less draconian one, like business rescue. Does this tell us anything? I mean, is the South African Post Office financial position beyond redemption?
Well, first of all, thank you for your interest. In fact, I think that particular creditor that brought that action is now being settled, so it worked. Okay. That doesn't mean to say there will not now be a whole bunch of other creditors. Once you into these kinds of discussions, you can't show preference from one creditor to another. Is the post office bankrupt? Yes, it is. Technically and absolutely it's bankrupt. In fact, it's got negative shareholders' funds. That means its liabilities exceed its assets as at March 2022, which is a year ago, by 4 odd billion. Which, if you juxtaposition that to the position that it was in 2019, when I left, we had plus 5 billion. Now we've got minus 4. So there's like a 9.5 billion swing, and that was a year ago. So you add another couple of billion to that, it is insolvent. Having said that, it's just got a capital injection of 2.4 billion. That won't make it solvent. But it is a slightly different animal, although it's a company in terms of the Companies Act. It's also a state-owned entity or a state-owned company. And I'd be surprised if the sovereign state could stand by and let one of its own, as it were, go bust. Yeah. That's not the focal point, though. The focal point is, what could we do without a post office? It's an absurd notion to think that South Africa would be the only economy of any size in the world that doesn't have a post office. Yeah, it seems that the Democratic Alliance has a different view, doesn't share that view. In fact, it feels that not even a single cent should be taken out of the state to bail out the post office. It should be liquidated. Tell me, why should the judge or the courts not give a final liquidation? Well, it will give a final liquidation order if indeed the state doesn't come to the party. I'm sure it will. I'll tell you why it shouldn't be allowed to be liquidated. Okay? And that's in the state's hands. It shouldn't be allowed to be liquidated because who will provide the services that could have and are being provided by the post office? Okay. And people say, well, let the private sector do it. Sure, at a price. Go and tell me how much it costs to send a letter from Johannesburg to Umtata through a private courier. And tell me how many people can afford that. Not many. Maybe 3 or 5% of the population would be serviced from a postal point of view. Who will pay social grants that doesn't want to extract a profit? You might recall that we took social grants back into an organ of state from private sector. The very next year, the private sector company that was doing social grants said they had lost $76 million per annum of revenue. That's 1.2 billion rand that was saved by the state. The Gogos, who had Section 26A deductions against their social grants, we cancelled those deductions. So the post office branch network is a place where citizens of South Africa should be able to go to get government services, including financial services and many other services, feeling that they are being looked after, feeling that the state is their guardian of their data, that they won't be exploited. So, yes, the private sector can do everything. We've seen it in healthcare, we've seen it in security, we've seen it in education, we've seen it everywhere. But for who? So, Mark, tell me then, I mean, when you came in, you got a little bit of cash injection from the government, which you required. You turned things around and you're saying when you left, there was no debt and you had no reason to go knocking at the doors of government. So what circumstances do you think led to the post office now having to deal with a creditor who wants rent clearly for many months, but also
benefits or contributions for employees are not being made, tax is not being paid. What actually happened?
Well, first of all, I've made it my business not to know what's going on in the post office since I left there. It's none of my business, okay? And it would be, to be blunt, it would be improper of me to criticize what happened there without knowing actually what happened. Let's say a few things in their favor. It was a difficult time, okay? COVID impacted on all businesses. It also impacted on the post office business, okay? There is not a sustainable economic model for focusing on post alone, letters and boxes and things of that nature. We have to have expanded the service, and in particular, we have to have access to the national payment system so that we can do things like social grant and processing, customs and e-commerce and things of that nature. So I don't think the post office could ever survive. And in fact, around the world, the post offices that are surviving all have financial services, all offer an integrated citizen model, all access the data of their citizens to provide them with a protected service, whether it's funeral policies or downloading education or whatever it might be. Okay, so I don't know what went wrong, but it went dramatically wrong. Once you stop paying over medical aid, that's criminal. That's not a commercial flaw. That's illegal. Okay, so, why these things weren't brought to a stop immediately. And I can only imagine what kind of property sales, because wherever I look, there's a branch closed here or a branch sold there. It's a disgrace, okay, that we are decimating the very essence of what the post office is, which is a commercially irreplaceable footprint, which is an organ of state.
Yeah.
And so we have to stand back and ask for what purpose these things. So it's like, the railway infrastructure. No one can build the railway infrastructure again in the private sector. You have to marry the commercial and developmental mandates. You have to marry the business acumen with the political will and the policy formulation to make these mixtures work on a sustainable basis and to respect and deploy the developmental mandates and transformation and things which are imperative to our society. So, I don't know what went wrong. The numbers are big. The diminution in value over the last 3 or 4 years has been something close to 10 billion. And so, it's for the Auditor General to disclose, how that's made up. I couldn't reconcile it from public information.
I'll come back in a moment to your 3 things that you say in your proposal needs to happen to turn this around. But I want to look at this condition that Treasury has put for the 2.4 billion bailout from Treasury. One of the things that they need to do is staff optimization. In other words, Treasury says, yes, they've cut costs in a number of how they operate, but the biggest chunk of it, I think 68% or so, is actually coming from them paying wages, and they need to drop that by a significant 20% or something like that. Can the post office be turned around without the implementation of this staff optimization?
The first day I approached the then Deputy President about the post offices was because they had then announced that they were going to close 652 branches and retrench 25% of the staff. And I said, Mr. Deputy President, there's another way. There's a growth story. And you should start looking at your staff as partners. You should create vested interest. They should have ownership of the upside if we can't afford to pay these salaries. I disagree fundamentally with the notion that the only way out is to reduce costs. You have to change revenue. There are 2 sides to that coin. Okay? And so you have to think of the post office differently. You have to get away from a mindset of rescuing or bailing out an old-fashioned post office and move towards investing in a new formulation of what is a post office. A bit like social grants. We don't pay social development in this country. We should. We should start developing individuals at the age of 6, but instead we pay social grants. It's social rescue. Okay. So we must stop rescuing things. We must stop, not changing the model that isn't working. And I fundamentally believe, and I'm not alone in this. And in fact, when I put in an offer, it wasn't me. I spoke to some serious logistics companies around the world, and I said, would this infrastructure, would this access be valuable to you? And there were a number that said yes. And I go to Amazon buying UPS. They bought 25% of UPS in the States. Why? Because you have to marry online access to physical delivery.
Yeah.
I've had discussions, I'm not going to name any more other names. But stop thinking about the post office as an old thing that delivers letters. It isn't.
Yeah.
It's a new thing.
So exactly, which speaks then to your 3 points in terms of your proposal. 1, of course, is the due diligence, work out what the assets are and what the value is, what is being owed.
The general can do that.
Yeah. Number 2 is a strategy. You want to come up with a very good strategy. And number 3, you want a solid management put in place. Why those 3 things?
Well, first of all, I think we didn't spend enough time between the management and the government, which is the shareholder, fully agreeing the boundaries of the strategy, where we were going and what we were allowed and not allowed to do in getting there. That is a discussion which needs deep interrogation, and once you've agreed it, leave. And then if it is working, let it go to where it's meant to go. Okay? So you have to know what you are. If you said to me, Mark, please go and run the post office and only deliver post office, I can't do that. Okay? It won't work. Like I said, I can't run a post office that hasn't got a bank as an integral offering and access to the national payment system. So strategy fundamentally has to be agreed, so we all know we're in our lane, and then the government must stay in its lane, and the business people must stay in their lane, and so on. Okay. The second thing was that you mentioned was management. Okay, we need, not just in the post office, but in many areas, to get over sitting on opposite sides of the table between government and business. We've got different roles to play, and we must stop getting in each other's way. Okay, and so I would argue that if you were to take this organization and set down a very specific 3-year deliverable of management transformation, that could be delivered. I would think it's incumbent, and we were setting out to do that, I would think it's incumbent on any CEO of the post office to deliver in 3 years' time a fully competent, demographically representative management of an SOE. It's imperative, and it can be done. Okay, and then capital. Capital is a sum of equations. You can't, have an unmatched equation. We would sit down, work out the forecast losses, what we're going to do, what we're not going to do, and then you would make an investment decision, not a rescue decision. And I think it could happen, but it's very close to dead. Very close to dead.
So if you were to be asked today, in 3 months' time, would you be able to raise, I think the sum that you're putting is around 11 billion rands to turn this thing around?
I wouldn't be putting in, no, actually, we'd buy the thing at net asset value. It's worth negative at the moment. It's got a negative value. The government would have to pay someone to take over the post office, but the reward they would get is that they would not have to fund losses anymore. They would have to sell the post office for a negative purchase price. In other words, pay someone to take over a bankrupt organization, and on the understanding that that's a party of substance and that the government can then stand back, retain a key shareholding and have certain vested rights, but never have to fund it again. That's the deal. The deal is not to go pay their money for something that's worth minus 5 billion.
So they would need to pay all the debt, liabilities, and hand over the asset to you, maybe with a little bit over 2 billion rands in the bank as well.
Something like that, something which makes sense, something which when you do the sums and you say to them, okay, you're going to inject whatever it is, let's call it 8 billion rand, it's going to sort out the losses, sort out all the backlog of creditors, and it's going to pay for the next 2 years' losses. Okay, and for that, we're going to say to you, we're going to convince you that you don't have to put in any more capital. The alternative is to say, okay, you keep it, and it'll continue to lose 2 billion a year. Well, it won't take you a hell of a long time to make up the 8 billion and still have a loss-making company. This is a turnaround of capital structure which says we want the right people, the right capital, doing the right things. We all agree with that. And we might start off as the government investing whatever the number is, 6-8 billion into the post office, but we would expect in due course to get a return, not to continue subsidizing. And it's that mindset of investment instead of having debates about who's in charge and who's in control. We want, this is not a political asset. It's an organ of state that could service our people, not hand that over to the private sector for capital gain.
Mark Barnes, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. Former South African Post Office CEO Mark Barnes.